No one expected Iran to become one of the most quietly decisive battlegrounds of World War II. Not because of bombs, not because of massive battles, but because of a decision made in secret that would reshape the entire war. In 1941, Iran was officially neutral, a country rich in oil, positioned between empires, and ruled by a man trying to keep his nation out of global chaos. Reza Shah, a leader determined to modernize Iran and protect its independence at all costs. But behind closed doors, two of the world's most powerful nations were watching him very closely. Because Iran wasn't just another country on the map. It was a lifeline, a bridge, and possibly the key to winning the war. At the time, no one in Iran fully understood how dangerous their position had become. To the north, the Soviet Union was under threat from Nazi Germany. To the west, Britain was fighting desperately to hold onto its empire. And right in the middle was Iran. What they were about to face would change everything. Because while Iran claimed neutrality, the Allies didn't believe it. Reza Shah had spent years reducing British influence in Iran. He pushed for independence, built infrastructure, and even allowed German engineers and advisors into the country. On paper, it looked like modernization. But to Britain, it looked like something else. A shift, a risk, a possible alliance forming in the shadows. And during a global war, uncertainty was dangerous. Very dangerous. So Britain started asking questions. Why were there so many Germans in Iran? What exactly were they doing? And more importantly, could Iran be trusted? At first, these concerns stayed quiet. Diplomatic pressure, careful negotiations, requests for Iran to expel German nationals. But Reza Shah refused. He believed neutrality meant independence. He believed Iran should not bow to foreign demands. And for a moment, it looked like he might succeed. But then, everything changed. June 1941. Hitler launches Operation Barbarossa, a massive invasion of the Soviet Union. Suddenly, the entire strategic landscape shifts. The Soviets are now desperate. They need supplies, weapons, food, fuel, and quickly. But there's a problem. Getting those supplies into the Soviet Union is nearly impossible. The usual routes are blocked or too dangerous. Except one. A narrow, fragile corridor running straight through Iran. What they didn't know was, this single route would turn Iran into one of the most important countries in the war overnight. The Allies called it the Persian Corridor, a supply line that could deliver American and British aid directly into the Soviet Union. But there was one issue. They didn't control it. Iran did. And Iran was still neutral. That wasn't acceptable. Not anymore. Now, the stakes were too high. If Iran remained outside Allied control, the entire war effort on the Eastern Front could collapse. Millions of lives, entire nations. Everything depended on keeping the Soviets in the fight. And suddenly, Iran wasn't just a neutral country. It was a problem. Behind closed doors, decisions were being made. Not by Iran, but about Iran. Britain and the Soviet Union reached a quiet understanding. They would act together and fast, because if they waited, Germany might make its move first, and that could change the outcome of the war completely. August 1941. Without warning, without declaration, the invasion began. From the north, Soviet forces crossed into Iranian territory. From the south, British troops advanced rapidly from Iraq. Iran's military was caught completely off guard. There was no time to prepare, no time to negotiate, only time to react. And the reactions were chaotic. Reza Shah faced a decision no leader wants to make. Fight back and risk total destruction, or stand down and risk losing everything anyway. Because the truth was brutal. Iran's military was not prepared for a two-front invasion by global superpowers. Resistance would be symbolic at best, catastrophic at worst. But surrender? That meant giving up control of the country he had spent years building. It meant admitting that neutrality had failed. It meant accepting that Iran's fate was no longer in Iranian hands. And as the invasion unfolded, confusion spread across the country. Civilians didn't understand what was happening. One day they were neutral. The next, foreign troops were moving through their cities. Railways, ports, roads. Everything suddenly became part of a war they never chose. And then, something even more unexpected happened. Inside Iran's leadership, cracks began to form. Some believed resistance was necessary. Others believed survival meant cooperation. And in the middle of it all, Reza Shah hesitated. Not because he didn't understand the situation, but because every option led to loss. And what he didn't know was, the Allies had already made another decision. One that would change Iran forever. Because this wasn't just about securing supply lines anymore. It was about control. And as Allied forces pushed deeper into the country, pressure on the Shah intensified. Messages, warnings, demands, step down, or face the consequences. It wasn't a negotiation. It was an ultimatum. And for the first time, Reza Shah realized something chilling. This invasion wasn't temporary. This wasn't about cooperation. This was about replacing him, removing him, erasing his influence completely. The question was no longer whether Iran could resist. It was whether its leader could survive politically. And as the days passed, the pressure became unbearable. Every decision delayed only made things worse. Every moment of hesitation brought the country closer to collapse. And then, Reza Shah made a move, a decision that shocked everyone around him. One that would define Iran's role in the rest of the war. But whether it would save the country, or seal its fate, no one knew yet. When Reza Shah finally made his decision, it didn't come with a speech. It didn't come with a grand moment. It came quietly, almost suddenly. He abdicated the throne. After years of consolidating power, modernizing his country, and resisting foreign influence, he stepped down. And in his place, his son took over, Mohammad Reza Shah, young, inexperienced, and now responsible for a country occupied by foreign powers. But this wasn't just a change in leadership. It was a signal. To the Allies, Iran would no longer resist. And almost immediately, everything shifted. The invasion slowed, the tension eased, and Iran transformed from a contested neutral nation into a critical Allied asset. The Persian corridor was now fully operational. Supplies began flowing at an astonishing scale. Trains carried weapons, food, fuel, and equipment across Iranian territory into the Soviet Union. American trucks rolled through Iranian roads. British engineers upgraded infrastructure. Soviet forces secured the northern regions. What had once been a sovereign nation trying to stay out of war was now one of the most important logistical hubs in the entire conflict. But beneath the surface, things weren't as stable as they seemed, because while the Allies had secured the corridor, they had also created something else: resentment. Among ordinary Iranians, the presence of foreign troops was impossible to ignore. Yes, there was economic activity. Yes, there was development. But there was also a growing feeling that Iran's independence had been compromised. That decisions were being made elsewhere. That their country had become a tool in someone else's war. And for Mohammad Reza Shah, the pressure was constant. He had to balance cooperation with control. He had to work with the Allies, while trying to maintain some sense of national authority. And that balance was fragile. Every decision mattered. Every misstep could shift the dynamic. Because even though the Allies were technically partners now, they were still occupying forces, and trust was limited. Then, in 1943, something remarkable happened. Tehran, Iran's capital, became the center of the world. Without warning to most of its citizens, 3 of the most powerful leaders on Earth arrived: Franklin D. Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, Joseph Stalin. The Tehran Conference, a meeting that would shape the final phase of World War II. But think about that for a moment. Iran, just 2 years earlier a neutral country trying to avoid conflict, was now hosting the leaders deciding the future of the world. And yet, Iran itself had very little say in those decisions. The conference focused on strategy, opening a second front in Europe, coordinating efforts against Nazi Germany, planning the final push toward victory. But for Iran, it highlighted something deeper, its importance, and its lack of control over that importance. Because while global leaders discussed the future, Iran remained occupied, its resources used, its land critical, but its voice limited. And when the war finally began to turn in favor of the Allies, a new question emerged. What happens to Iran after the war? The expectation was simple. Once the conflict ended, foreign troops would leave. Iran would regain full sovereignty. Everything would return to normal. But history rarely follows expectations. As World War II came to a close, British forces began preparing to withdraw. But in the north, the Soviet Union hesitated. They delayed. They lingered. And suddenly, Iran faced a new kind of uncertainty. Not invasion, but occupation without an end date. Tensions rose again. Diplomatic pressure returned. But this time, the world was watching differently. Because the war was over, and what was happening in Iran looked less like wartime necessity and more like something else. The early signs of a new global conflict. The Cold War. Iran had unintentionally become one of its first flashpoints. Under international pressure, the Soviets eventually withdrew. But the message was clear. Iran's position in the world had changed permanently. It was no longer just a regional power. It was a strategic prize, a nation whose location, resources, and influence made it impossible to ignore. And for Mohammad Reza Shah, this reality would define his rule for decades. Balancing global powers, managing internal pressure, trying to maintain independence in a world where larger forces were always watching. But the real twist, the part most people don't realize, is that Iran's role in World War II wasn't just about what happened during the war. It was about what came after. The invasion, the occupation, the forced abdication, the strategic importance. All of it set the stage for future events that would shape the Middle East for generations. Because once a country becomes that important, it never really goes back to being ignored. And Iran never did.